So last week, the four principles that I mentioned to you were, number one, the Bible should be read like any other book, you'll remember. Number two, the Bible should be read, and I use the word existentially, I use it rather guardedly, but what I mean by that is simply put yourself in the situation, especially when you're reading narrative material, to actually live it a little bit, feel it. Third, we talked about historical material being interpreted in light of what's called didactic or teaching information, so that material that is actually designed to instruct us is used to shed light on typically historical circumstances, which may or may not lead us to accurate theological understandings. We use the example of Abraham and God saying to him, "Now I know," you know. We could infer from that that God learns things. Now I know. I didn't know 5 minutes ago, Abraham, what's going on you do? So up here biting my nails, wondering, but now I know. You see, like God was enlightened on that occasion. But of course, the rest of the scripture leaves little doubt that God is never enlightened in that sense. God never comes to a new insight, you know. He's always in possession of all information about all things at all times. And so the historical narrative there is illumined or is clarified by what we know from didactic material biblically. And then we looked and we left with the fourth of these, the implicit in light of the explicit, and we talked about that. And the one we had this morning is really an extension of that. This will be in the fifth in this, and that is that the obscure should be interpreted by the clear. Now, Ken Kimball was sitting right over here last week, and he was the one that actually raised that, you'll recall. And I think he attributed to Luther, and I think Luther actually can be held responsible for most of these, if not all of these principles, but through Protestant history in particular, these have been clarified and worked out in many different ways. If you can't read that, obscure, I know that says obscure, but you're wrong. It's obscure by the clear. So that's what that says. So anyway, this is the idea. We read the Bible, and of course, as we go along, we find that there's some text, in fact, probably most the material in the scripture is quite clear. But ever so often you run into a verse that's not so clear. It's obscure. Its meaning doesn't immediately impress itself on you. You read it, you scratch your head, you're like, what does that mean? And there's a tendency, or at least there's a temptation, I suppose, occasionally to take verses that we run into that are obscure and draw from that obscure verse a certain understanding, and then use that understanding based on that obscure verse to overrule other things in the Bible that are perfectly clear, you see. And that, of course, would be reversing the correct order, not only for reading the Bible, but reading anything. That any document that has obscure texts within it should be read such that the clear texts help us understand the obscure and not vice versa. But especially in reading the Bible, this has not necessarily always been a rule that's been followed with great consistency. And the one example that is really my favorite on this one is in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, where you may recall, Paul does a lengthy treatise on the idea of resurrection. And he's arguing against the Corinthians there, many of whom apparently, being up-to-date, sophisticated, first-century Corinthians, believed that there was no resurrection, that was simply not a part of the Christian faith that they could buy off on. But they still thought it was perfectly lovely to be a Christian anyway, you see. And they felt that, well, hey, even if there isn't a resurrection, this is still the happiest way to live, you know. I've heard that expressed sometimes, maybe you have too, sort of a popular expression of Christianity, where I remember going to a Christian concert once, and this was a few years ago, maybe 15 or 20 years ago, and this female Christian artist, very wonderful performer, very talented, got up and sang, and everybody was inspired by her music. And then midstream, she gave a little sermonette, you know, which she would have done better to leave out, I think. But in that sermonette, she says, it's just so exciting to be a Christian. It's just so wonderful Even if I discovered that there isn't a God, that there isn't heaven, that there isn't, all of these things up in the future, I'd still want to be a Christian because it's just the happiest way to live, And that's what she said. I wondered if she had ever read 1 Corinthians 15, where Paul says, if there is no resurrection, we are of all people most pitiable. We're the most pathetic creatures that have ever come along if there is no resurrection, because we're knocking ourselves out to live a life of obedience to Christ for no good reason. I mean, let's face it, being a Christian is an extremely inconvenient way of life. We're always having to stop the action and do nice things for people. If I didn't think it was a resurrection, then forget it. I'm out of here, Let's get on with it. But anyway, that was her analysis there. But my point in raising this is that Paul gives us this really wonderful analysis of the significance of resurrection in the life of the Christian, in the faith of the Christian, and he throws this little curveball in. He says, somewhere around verse 20 or in that vicinity, he says, else, why are they baptized for the dead? If the dead rise not, why are they baptized for them? And you're reading along there, and everything's making perfect sense. You just follow Paul's logic without a problem. It's all lucid, it's all clear, and then all of a sudden, bam, what is this? Baptized for the dead. Paul, what are they talking about here? You see, I think by just about anybody's measures, that is an obscure verse. There's one reference in the whole Bible to the practice of baptizing in connection with some sort of apparent benefit for those who have died. And this is the verse. And Paul raises it just that way. Why are they baptized for the dead? Now, I think you're aware that in the Mormon Church, that verse has become the basis for an incredible, highly involved, very expensive and sophisticated program of baptizing people for all sorts of dead people, My great Aunt Sally, I can go down and be baptized, and that somehow accrues some benefit for her, and on it goes, and all of the genealogical studies and all of those sorts of things. At least the biblical foundation for that, if you ask a Mormon person, will be 1 Corinthians 15, Else, why do they baptize for the dead? Now, do any of you know of any text in the Bible which is hopefully somewhat more clear than this obscure verse in 1 Corinthians 15? The one and only mention of baptizing for the dead in the whole Bible, there it is. Do any of you know of any verse in the Bible that might also bear on the same subject and might be somewhat more definitive in treating the subject of whether or not baptizing for the dead would be a worthy, enterprise, or might actually create some benefit for dead people? Does anyone have any verse in mind that just it comes to you here? We'll call on the lay people first, and then we'll pigeonhole the reverends in the room. Shelby, were you going to propose a verse? I saw your hand there. Oh, well, that's okay. Yeah, that might not actually. Well, how about this one? See if you think this has anything to do with the same subject. This is in Hebrews chapter 9, about the next to the last verse in that chapter. And it says, it is given unto man once to die, after that, judgment. Does that have anything to do with the same subject, do you think? In other words, we have one theory that I can die, and then I'm in a kind of holding pattern, and if somebody somewhere will be baptized for me, it'll actually help me. We have another verse in the Bible that says, it's given unto man once to die, afterwards judgment, you see. Now that, as you take those two verses, in other words, and put them together, one of them, it seems, is pretty clear. One of them is very obscure. And before we start building great monuments on an obscure verse, trying to justify all kinds of practices that the rest of the Bible doesn't even suggest are appropriate, it's helpful, you see, to find out what the rest of the temple of Scripture is. It might be interesting, by the way, to know that probably the reason Paul wrote that, if you're curious about that, was and this is not altogether clear, but probably the best guess is that there was a pagan practice in Corinth of baptizing for the dead, which the Corinthians were fully aware of. And what Paul is calling attention to is the fact that even in paganism, there's a kind of tacit understanding that the dead will rise. it's so deeply embedded within us that even without a Christian context at all, we still kind of impulsively do something to express our inner instinct that there is resurrection. And you might say, if Paul were writing it to 20th century Spokanites like us, he might say, if he were writing to us, the same sort of critique, he might say, otherwise, why do people put flowers on graves if the dead rise not? You see, in other words, why do we do things to continue, as it were, to recognize the significance of a human life departed, if not for the fact that it somehow shows inside us? We believe there's some sort of continuing significance there, that that person is not dead and gone, that somehow there's a continuity of existence that may very likely someday express itself, you see, in some sort of resurrection. Now that's, like I say, not known for certain, but there's some evidence to that effect. But it certainly was not, you see, in Paul's mind. I don't think there's any justification for the idea that Paul was actually instructing the church to inaugurate a great program of baptizing people for the dead. But that's a good example of, taking an obscure verse and stretching it beyond its parameters. My practice through the last week or two has been to stop after each one of these and ask if you have any input rather than waiting till the end. So does this precipitate any questions, comments, thoughts, rejoinders? I didn't give you any warning, but I was going to do this midstream here, so all right, we'll go to the next one. The next one is probably a fairly obvious one. It has to do with word meanings. We were indicating last week that the Bible should be read like any other book. Not to say it is any other book. It's unique among the books of the world, but it's still a book, and that's the point. God has stooped to give us that which comes to us through the same mechanism that we use otherwise in human communication. God has given us a book. And so the fact that it comes to us in a book form, or and I use book broadly, maybe it came in scroll form or whatever, but the point is, it comes to us as an expression of human literary communication. And that, by the nature of the case, involves us then in words, and thus the words become rather important, and especially learning the meanings of the words. And I'm actually going to do something I plan to do more of next week, but just suggest to you, I'm not a book salesman now this morning, so I get no kickback on this. But this is one of several. I mean, there's many different Bible dictionaries out there. This just happens to be one that I have on my shelf that I found useful, called Unger's Bible Dictionary, produced by Moody Press. But there's many others, and some come from a more reformed perspective, which would also be equally, in fact, in some ways preferable. But just by way of example, this is a book, you see, which is a dictionary of the words in the Bible. So you're reading along in a certain text, and you find a word, and you're not sure what it means. One good place to go is just to an English dictionary. Webster, can shed a lot of light on the Bible sometimes, just reading and finding out what the English word itself means and what its history is. A book like this, Unger's Bible Dictionary, or other Bible dictionaries, there's many of them that are out there that are quite good, it gives you something of the background. So if you flip this one open and look to a particular term, then you'd find here's the word porch. You might not guess, but there's really quite a bit that can be said about the nature of a porch, and sometimes it sheds some light to see on what might be going on in a particular text. Here's a reference to Potter's Gate. You read that, you might just kind of pass that. This is from Jeremiah 19:2, mentions the Potter's Gate, and there's a little short essay on that, that gives you some clarity. That's the point. It's just simply learning the meanings of the words. Now, you might be interested in knowing, I don't recommend this unless you really are pretty compulsive, and I tend to be fairly compulsive, but this is not necessarily something that everyone in the world would care to wade through. But this is one of 10 volumes. This is called Kittle's Theological Dictionary of the New Testament. Each of these volumes runs about $35 a piece. And a few years ago, I just kind of chopped away at these, not really having the money to do it, but bought these about one every 2 or 3 months until I accumulated. Finally, the last 2 or 3 volumes came as a gift from this class. I don't know if some of you remember that. It was about 5 years ago or more, maybe now. Well, probably more. How long ago it was Randy Steele was here. So it had to be, I guess, quite a bit more now that I think about it. I think it was why I just finished teaching the Westminster Confession, in fact, so that makes it more like 9 or 10 years ago. And this class gave me the last 3 or 4 volumes of this set. But anyway, what it is, it's, you have to go a little Greek to really make sense out of it. But let me give you an example of how this works. I tagged one here that I thought might be of interest to you. This is you would look up a word in this, look up the Greek word. So I look up the Greek word phos. Phi, omega, sigma, phos, from which we get English words like photography, you know, or photon torpedo, if you happen to watch Star Trek. And a few other words that are related to that, photizo, photismos, and certain others. There's about 7 or 8 words that are all cognates of the Greek word phos. And now this is just one word in the Bible, the word light, you know. And yet, what this remarkable book has done, or this series of volumes has done, is taken that word and analyzed it, certainly done the most exhaustive analysis of the meaning and usage of that word in the ancient world that's ever been done in the history of the church. This is a 20th century product, probably the greatest expression of linguistic scholarship in the 20th century. And so I'm just going to give you some of the headings here. The word group in Greek, he mentions, and then the word group referring to this word toast in the Old Testament, especially the Septuagint version. Its usage in Judaism, apart from Philo. This is all pages now on post. In Hellenism and Gnosticism, so several pages on that. All different subgroups of those, goes on quite a ways. And finally get subsection E to the New Testament. How does the New Testament use? This was all background, you see. And now we get to the New Testament, and it talks about its occurrence, the Synoptic Gospel, and Acts, the Pauline corpus, and so on, St. John's epistles, how, of course, it's an important word to John, goes on. Then we have the early church. So these are the post-apostolic fathers. Now, these would be the people in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th century, and how they use the word, and on it goes. And so all of that, you know, like 40 pages here, 311 to 358, is all extensive analysis of one word, you see. I mention this for a couple of reasons, not because I want you to go out and buy this set, you know, unless you really, I mean, it's great. I'd certainly be happy if you did. But you know, there's a certain cult out there that says this. They say, well, we believe the Bible insofar as it was correctly translated. I want you to know, there's not a book in the history of the planet where there has been more exacting, exhaustive, scholarly, critical analysis of the text and an attempt to make sure we got the right sense to those words than the Bible. I mean, to talk about what, you know, insofar as it was correctly translated is really to almost raise a specious kind of you know, critique. The Bible has far and away had more focus on the meanings of the words than any other book that, you know, human language has ever produced. I'd say this to you to give you some assurance. I guess that's my point. You know, for the casual Bible reader, even a serious way, the student of the Scriptures, this is probably overkill. And so it's not like you have to do this to read the Bible. I just want you to know that a lot of the scholarship that you find in a book like Kittle's is sort of distilled nicely in little volumes like this. So you grab this and you get the best of that without wading through, you know, the post-apostolic fathers and Philo and Alexandrian Christianity and the Old Testament and the LXX and all of that stuff. You know, all of it kind of is brought together and made palatable in a book like this. And I'll just tell you the honest truth, I use this a lot more than that. So this really looks impressive on the shelf, though, I'll tell you. So if you come to my house sometime, I'll be sure to show it. I'm very proud of it. But anyway, my point here is, let's understand that when the New Testament writers were using language, they were using the language of the day, what we sometimes call the lingua franca, you know, or it's actually called the Koine, or a better term might be the street Greek of the New Testament. When Paul wrote, he was writing what's called Koine Greek, which was the language of the marketplace. It was not a holy language, a sort of superior language that had some special sacred esoteric meaning to it that only a few people with great kind of spiritual insight or something understood. No, no, no. This was language that was just kind of the street language of the day, Koine Greek. And so Paul used that language, used it in a very sophisticated way because he was trained to do that. Of course, the other New Testament authors, same thing. But the point is, knowing that helps us, because when Paul makes a statement, we have some handles, some ways of going back and asking, what did that statement mean then? And so it helps us make sense out of it today. Another good example would be in the beginning of John's Gospel. Of course, you're aware he uses the word logos, L-O-G-O-S. And you see, that word was just loaded with significance in the ancient world. This was a word that had taken on all kinds of significance. So that when John began, his gospel, in arche ein ho logos, in the beginning was the word. That meant something to those people. You see, that word logos it's the word from which we get the word logic. This wasn't just word in general. This was word in a very particular sense, and it had a cultural content that meant something to the people. And so, when you're reading John chapter 1, you might want to get a little Unger here and look up the word and find out that was a loaded term in those days that implied a whole lot. In other words, the people who read that realized what John was saying was, here is the fundamental coordinating principle of all human existence. In the beginning was that which ties it all together, the logos, the logic, the reason, you see, of God. And if you just saw the word, that might not occur to you. All of that is sort of built into that text. Any comment on that? Any thoughts or questions about that one before we press on? You see, if you were my class out of footwork, I wouldn't let you get away with this. I call on people. I'm ruthless. I feel like I have to be polite in church. I don't know why that is. Yes, thank you, Laverne. Please, great. Well, the last great find was the Dead Sea Scrolls, and that helped us because it gave us our first glimpse back into the Old Testament document. That was really what was significant there. Old Testament, right. And what it did, it sometimes surprises people to know that up until the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, the most ancient documents that we had, ancient copies of Old Testament material, dated to 900 A.D. You see, we didn't have any document that we could say was actually a product, a copy, or anything else that went back, certainly, to the Old Testament period. These were all copies of copies, and the Masoretic order of monks had been responsible for preserving some of these, and so it was still called the so-called Masoretic text, which was 900 A.D. The Dead Sea Scrolls kicked us back 1,000 years to where we now have some copies of Old Testament texts dating 100 B.C., you see. And everybody was all excited because we were going to find out, there was the critical scholars were thinking, now we're going to find out that there were tons of errors and copy problems and all of this sort of thing, and now we've got these more ancient scrolls and we'll get all sorts of illumination. Of course, the great surprise, great positive, pleasant surprise to people who like to believe the Bible was that there was virtually no difference. I mean, this 1,000 years earlier, and we had basically, when I say basically, I mean almost totally the same text. We had a complete text of Isaiah from the Dead Sea Scrolls, and it was virtually identical. Every John and every Kittle, you see, to what we've been dealing with. And that just gave a great deal of confidence that what we have today as texts really reflects very, very accurately. If you did the same kind of thing with, for example, Plato's Republic, all of the various versions and copies of Plato's Republic that are extant today, and you go back and try to piece together what was the original text, it's chaos. It is chaos. The Bible is, compared to something like Plato's Republic or other ancient documents, is so internally consistent. That is, there's so much unanimity among the copies that, the little variants tend to be so minor, so tiny, so inconsequential that you wonder why anybody bothers. But the reason people bother is because there's such a love for the text that we just want to be as sure as we can that what we have is as close a replication of what was actually written back there, that this scholarly machine just keeps running, and people devote their lives to, hunting down tiny little variants to make sure we've got it just right. So it's a major scholarly effort that we are the beneficiaries of. In many ways, we don't even know it. We don't even know what's going on. But what it tells us is that those words are important, and that there's been a lot of effort to make sure we have the benefit of what the words actually were, so we can have that kind of confidence. All right, let me give you the next one. Now we get a little bit more kind of detailed examples here, and there's a lot of these I could give you. I just want to give you some that are more, have a common, I don't know if I spell it right, parallelism. That doesn't look very good, does it? Let's try it again. Now you start with parallel, P-A-R-A, thank you, L-L-E-L, right? Now, a couple of weeks ago, in fact, 2 or 3 weeks ago, I was suggesting that as we read the scriptures, we want to look for what Luther called the sensus literalis, or the sense of the literature. And it's especially helpful to realize that there are certain literary structures, literary constructions, you might say, that were common to especially to the Hebrews, that we do not so commonly use in our own method of communication. Hebrew was a concrete language, much more than our Western languages, which tend to be more abstract, trace back more to the Greek language. Hebrew was concrete, and it was very poetic. So even casual conversation could easily take on a poetic kind of overtone to it, much more so, for example, than would take place in English. Although if you heard the sermon this morning, then you might doubt what I'm saying now, the attitudes and gratitudes and platitudes. So that was good. That's a good way to make it stick in your mind there. But anyway, this kind of poetic structure comes out in many different forms. One of the most common is what's called the Hebrew parallelism. This is something you have read hundreds of times. You may already be familiar with it, but whether you're familiar with the term or not, believe me, you'll be familiar with the concept, because if you read the Old Testament at all, you've read this over and over again. Virtually every page of the Old Testament has an example. But essentially a parallelism would be, I'm going to give you a couple of examples. One is in Proverbs here. Proverbs 19:5. But I'm just using this strictly by way of example, and Proverbs, in fact, uses this over and over. Virtually every verse in Proverbs will be an example of it. A parallelism would be, the most simple form would be called a synonymous parallelism, where you have 2 lines, 2 or more, but typically 2, and each line uses different words, but the sense of each line is the same. So for example, one line is essentially synonymous with the other line, just using different words. Now here's a very typical example. A false witness will not go unpunished, and he who speaks lies will not escape. Now you hear that and you realize it's the same thing twice. Different words, same meaning. A false witness will not go unpunished, and he who speaks lies will not escape. Doesn't that sound like the Old Testament, you see? Because you just see this again and again. That's called a parallelism. Now the reason that's helpful in terms of Bible interpretation is because a synonymous parallelism, you have a little key to an insight here. If one line in the parallelism is obscure, but the other line is clear, then you can let the clear line help you understand the obscure line, And many, many times that can be very useful. I'm going to give you a good example here in a second, but just kind of keep that in mind. Sometimes a parallelism can be antithetical, where the second line is the opposite of the first. Let me give you, this is Proverbs 13:1. Proverbs is a great book, a good primer on parallelisms, because so many are found here. Listen to this one now. Proverbs 13:1. A wise son heeds his father's instruction, but a scoffer does not listen to rebuke, you see. Now there you've got a very typical, what's called antithetical parallelism. One line gives us an affirmative statement, and the other line gives its opposite, stating just the opposite of what the first one was. So you've got all kinds of examples of this. Let me give you another one that you'll fill in the blank on this one. Pride goes before, wrong. Pride goes before, does anybody know how that verse goes? What? Who's saying it? Somebody's whispering it. Oh, well. That's right. Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. Now, there's a good example where there's a parallelism, and we have, in common usage, truncated it. And instead of going pride goes before destruction, we go pride goes before a fall. And that would be perfectly legitimate, because to the Hebrew, it's a parallel structure. We could say just as easily, pride goes before a fall and a haughty spirit before destruction. But the point is, one clarifies the other. And in our popular expression, we've just done that little truncation of the thing. You see how that works? And it's a very common kind of phenomenon, which you'll see in the Old Testament. Now, let me give you one which, this one has been clarified, I would say, in more recent translations. It used to be a real source of concern to people who would read it. This is in Isaiah 45, verses 6 and 7. I'm going to give you basically the way it read in the King James. I'm reading here from the New King James, and I'm going to substitute in at the critical point the Old King James language and see if there's anything in this verse that distresses you. So here it is. This is Isaiah 45, 6 and 7. Quote, "That they may know from the rising of the sun to its setting that there is none besides me. I am the Lord, there is no other. I form the light and create darkness. I make peace and create evil. I, the Lord, do all these things." Anything there that catches your attention? What kind of jars us a little bit as we hear that verse read? I create evil. And yet we think now, even the Calvinists among us are a little bit jolted by that one, you see, that God creates evil, and because if there's anything, the Westminster Confession, itself is very clear there that God is neither the author or origin of evil, certainly in terms of the sovereign providence and so on, in terms of what God is doing in history, he uses evil to his own purposes. He uses Judas betraying Christ to a good purpose, and yet to say God actually creates evil, it's something we have a hard time living with. And the key to understanding that text is to recognize, this is a good example now of an obscure text and a clear text, and using the interpretive insight here that this is a parallelism. Now think about, this is verse 7, and this is like an antithetical parallelism inside a synonymous parallelism. It can be rather intricate, but listen to how this works. I form the light and create darkness. There's the first line. You see there, you have a kind of, you have two ideas set in contrast, the light and the darkness. I do light, I do darkness. Those two are sort of antithetical to each other, but God takes credit for both. You see, so there's the first line. Then the second line, which is synonymous with it, has the same kind of internal construction, setting one thing against its opposite. And so I create the light, or I form the light and create darkness, and then he says, I make peace and create what? Or what's the opposite of peace? War. Not evil. But the old King James, you see, pulled in the word evil because evil could be that kind of expression of the opposite of peace. But it's not exactly the idea. In fact, in the New King James, it's translated calamity. You see, I bring another version puts it weal and woe. Now, the point is, God is perfectly happy to take credit for the calamitous that takes place among us. And in many cases in the Old Testament, he will do that without any hesitation whatsoever. That calamities may come in judgment for whatever purposes, to discipline his people, you name it, God will own it. And yet that's not quite the same thing as saying God actually creates or authors evil, you see. And there's a now, like I say, newer translations have actually helped us with that, so we wouldn't need to know all this fancy parallelism stuff to get it right. But knowing that helps, and in some texts it can be very helpful. It's just one example of that. In the New Testament, it occurs also, not quite so frequently because the New Testament was not written in Hebrew, but Jesus, for example, uses parallelism in the Lord's Prayer. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Those are probably parallel. You see, thy kingdom come is basically the same thing as thy will be done. You see. Give us this day our daily bread. Then this one, lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. There's a parallelism, you see. And people have kind of choked on that one. It's like, why would I pray to God not to lead me into temptation? It seems like that's the last thing God would do, is lead me into temptation. Doesn't James tell us that God neither tempts anyone nor is tempted, you see? So why am I asking God to do the thing of what he would never do? But if we understand that's in parallel there in that text, it's really, lead us not into temptation is essentially the same thing as deliver us from evil. And actually the evil there is topaniwan, the evil one. Deliver me from the evil one, And so to understand, lead me not into temptation is essentially to protect me from, you see, the tempting powers of the evil one. And that helps, I think, in that text. Sometimes these become very elaborate, and if you get sensitive to them, you just see them all the time. Psalm 1 would be 2 paragraphs that are parallel to each other, and yet each paragraph has a bunch of internal parallelisms as well. So that the whole psalm is kind of an antithetical parallelism with a bunch of synonymous parallelisms within them. So listen to how it goes. Blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the ungodly, stands in the way of sinners, sits in the seat of the scornful, but his delight is in the law of God. In his law he meditates day and night. He will be like a tree planted by the waters, bears his fruit and boosts whatsoever he does process. All of that you see is kind of you see many parallel stanzas there aligned in that first paragraph. Then the second paragraph of Psalm 1 says, but the ungodly are not so. And then all the things that are stated about the ungodly sort of stand in contrast to what was stated about the blessed person there. And those 2 paragraphs are antithetical to each other, one shedding light by way of contrast, you see, on the other. So, and the list goes on. I think if you're aware of those and you start looking for them, the book of Proverbs, of course, is replete with them, but all the way through the Old Testament, you'll see them, beginning in Genesis chapter 1, and all the way through, you see those. So there's one example of a kind of literary structure that we don't commonly use in English, but where if you know the literary idea, that it could be helpful. Another example, again, of something that is not really distinctively Hebraic, but worth mentioning here. This is proverb and law. There is, as you're aware, in the book of Proverbs, all kinds of counsel that is given to us, and it many times comes to us as instruction that takes the form of a command. And yet sometimes if you read the Proverbs, you do have the feel that it's not the same level of command that we might find, for example, in the 10 Commandments or something like that. And this is a good thing to keep in mind, that even in the Old Testament there is a differentiation of varying, you might say, weights or dignity that's attached to various kinds of commands, and that there is such a thing in the Old Testament as simply practical, proverbial counsel that is not necessarily of the same weight as a command that might come, a la the 10 Commandments. This resolves some problems, because I think you're aware that sometimes proverbial sayings can conflict with each other. What I was thinking of here was, we have in our culture a couple of proverbial statements. These aren't biblical now, but these are just things we hear. But you'll hear people say sometimes, something like this: look before you leap. You've heard that. A warning not to be too impulsive. Think about it for a minute before you dive in with both feet. Look before you leave. Are there any other proverbs you can think of in our culture that might give you a different sort of? That's what I was thinking of. There's Mr. Proverbs right over there. So he who hesitates is lost. So what are you going to do? You look before you leave, but he who hesitates is lost. It's conflicting counsel. And yet there's a little bit of wisdom in both, isn't there? And I guess that's the point. When you read the book of Proverbs, you'll find that it's practical counsel. And sometimes you'll see things that are a little bit in conflict with others, but that's okay, because the whole idea here is simply to give us practical guidance. It's not the same thing as, for example, thou shalt not kill. You see, I mean, the proverbial expressions in the book of Proverbs don't have that level of dignity to them. So, for example, you'll have warnings in the book of Proverbs, let's say, against going surety. There's a good example. You shouldn't co-sign somebody else's financial obligation. Just between you and me, that's very sane counsel. Somebody wants to come, I don't know how many times, not a whole lot, but I'm sure at least maybe 10 times or so, I suppose, in the years I practiced law, I've had people come in, long face. I had it happen within the last 2 months. Someone came in and said, I co-signed a loan. Is there any way I can get out of it? Ain't no way you can get out of it. They didn't get anything out of it. There's no consideration, but it's enforceable at law. It's a dumb thing to do. But that doesn't mean it's a sinful thing to do, you see, and that's the point. It may be unwise, but it doesn't mean that you've just committed a great moral crime. And sometimes a parent, for example, will co-sign an obligation for a child to help them establish credit or whatever. And maybe within that limited context, that's a perfectly, legitimate thing to do. And a person shouldn't feel that they just violated biblical law by